Hello, I'm Captain Stan Cope, and I'm the Director of the Armed Forces Pest Management Board in Washington, D.C. It's my pleasure to be with you today and to tell you a little bit about the history of yellow fever. But first I'd like to tell you a little bit about my background. I'm originally from Huntington, Indiana, and I graduated with a bachelor's degree in biology from Swarthmore College and got my master's degree in medical entomology from the University of Delaware and a PhD in public health from a place called the University of California at Los Angeles, which some of you might be familiar with. After I graduated, I joined the United States Navy as a medical entomologist, and I've been doing that for the past 22 years. The presentation that you're going to hear today originally had its beginnings while I was a graduate student at UCLA. I was not doing very well in my dissertation work, and I needed something to hold my interest and to stimulate my brain a little bit. So I got very interested in the history of diseases transmitted by insects, especially yellow fever. The talk was first given at the Ohio Mosquito Control Association in 1991, and I've been giving it off and on all around the world for the past 20-some odd years. It's been about 110 years since the work that I'm going to tell you about in Cuba was done, but there still has been some considerable controversy about these experiments, and I'll try to point out some of those things as we go. And finally, I have to tell you that the opinions and assertions that you're about to hear are mine and mine alone and do not necessarily represent the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Navy, or the Armed Forces Pest Management Board. So let's get into our story now. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the disease yellow fever. It's caused by a specific virus, which we have cleverly named the yellow fever virus. The disease is spread by mosquito bite, specifically by the yellow fever mosquito, or what's known as Aedes aegypti and other species. Today, the disease occurs in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as in South America, and there are still several thousand cases each year and thousands of deaths, according to the World Health Organization. And this is one of these diseases that we probably never will be able to get rid of, because the virus is maintained in a cycle that involves mosquitoes and monkeys living in the forest and jungle canopies. Humans in this case are what's called an incidental or dead-end host, and they are not necessary for the virus to survive in nature. It's important to talk a little bit about the clinical appearance of yellow fever. After a person is infected by a mosquito, if the mosquito is in fact carrying the virus, after 4 or 5 or 6 days the person starts to develop headache, fever, nausea, and horrific pain, particularly in the joints. Also, the liver becomes involved and causes the skin to turn yellow or causes jaundice, and hence that's one derivation of the word of the name of the disease, yellow fever. And then after a few more days, in most of the cases, the person starts to get better, and it takes several days to fully recover. And once a person is infected with yellow fever, they can never get the disease again. They are immune to a second infection. However, in some cases, the disease takes a turn for the worse. After about 5 or 6 days, the person starts to hemorrhage, starts to bleed internally, particularly in the stomach, and they get very, very ill, and they actually start throwing up partially digested blood, which is known clinically as black vomit. This is why the disease in Spanish-speaking countries is known as vomito negro. Once black vomit occurs, the case is fatal. The patient becomes delirious, frequently has to be held down in bed while they're vomiting, and it really is a pretty nasty end, and that's all I'll say about that. I think you get the picture. There is no specific treatment for yellow fever, as there is not for most of the viruses transmitted by insects. It's generally supportive care, replacing the fluids, and making the patient as comfortable as possible. But there is a very highly effective vaccine, so people can be vaccinated against it. The following story is that of a prolific and savage killer, yellow fever, and the events by which the veil of this terrible scourge was lifted. Some of the heroes' names will be familiar to you, but most will not. My presentation contains 4 parts. First, I will present a brief history of yellow fever and its impact on our society. Second, I will outline the experiments done in Cuba, which elucidated the mode of transmission of this disease. Third, I will tell you about two young men and their roles in one of the great medical discoveries of our time. And finally, you will hear about a true American heroine and her ultimate sacrifice. We believe that yellow fever originated in Africa and made its first visit to the New World in the late 16th or early 17th century. For the next 300 years or so, the disease ravaged hundreds of cities in North America, from Texas to Massachusetts, as well as the great Mississippi Valley. Each wave of pestilence was marked by economic shamble, human panic, and widespread death. From 1668 to 1893, there were 135 major epidemics in United States port cities. In 1793, yellow fever claimed 1 of every 10 Philadelphians, a total of 4,000 dead. New Orleans, a frequent victim of attack, suffered 29,000 cases and over 8,000 dead in 1853. And during the summer of 1878, a huge epidemic shattered the United States. 132 towns affected, 75,000 cases, 16,000 deaths, and a cost of over $100 million in 1878 dollars. That would be a lot more money today. Clearly, this was a colossal public health calamity. Well, medical authorities argued over the mode of transmission. Some, such as the gentleman seen in this slide, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a physician in Philadelphia and a signer of our Declaration of Independence, believed that yellow fever was spread by miasmatic or poisoned air. One of the things that the people in Philadelphia regularly thought caused yellow fever were coffee grounds that were dumped on the wharves along the river and left there to rot. Others felt the disease was spread by things called fomites, that is, articles such as bedding or clothing that were believed to be contaminated somehow. Preventive measures included cigar smoking by women and children and massive burning of suspect items. This clearly was a very scary time in our world. Volunteers used to drive horse-drawn carts through the streets of Philadelphia and bang a bell and call out, "Bring out your dead." And families would push their deceased loved ones out through the door into the street and quickly slam the door closed. At the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, Cuba was given to the United States by Spain. And what a deal this was! In Havana, dead animals were lying in the streets, typhoid fever was lurking everywhere, and yellow fever was always a threat. During the war, 2,450 Americans had died in Cuba, 385 in battle, and the rest from disease. In early 1900, yellow fever killed many of the United States Army officers who had been posted there. The wife of one officer committed suicide after her husband's unexpected demise. Pictured here is the Surgeon General at the time, George Miller Sternberg. He was considered the leading expert on yellow fever. Through his efforts, Special Order number 122 was issued by the Army on May 24, 1900. This order established a board, and I quote, "for the purpose of pursuing scientific investigations with reference to the acute infectious diseases on the island of Cuba, giving special attention to questions relating to the etiology or the origin and prevention of yellow fever." The president of the board was Major Walter Reed, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, an Army surgeon from Virginia. Reed had recently distinguished himself working on typhoid fever in Army camps around the U.S. and was the logical choice to lead the effort. An Englishman, Dr. James Carroll, was primarily responsible for the bacteriology work of the board. He had been associated with Reed since 1893 and was highly trusted by him. And he would soon turn out to be the first experimental case of yellow fever. Dr. Aristides Agramante handled pathology and autopsies. A Cuban physician, he was picked primarily because he was believed to be immune to yellow fever due to prior infection. Remember, I said earlier that once you survive a case of yellow fever, you cannot get sick from the disease for the rest of your life. The fourth and final member of the board was Dr. Jesse W. Lazier. He had been a classmate of Agramonte's at Columbia and was hired by the Army as a contract surgeon. In exactly 4 months, Lazier, who handled the mosquito colonies, would be dead from yellow fever at the age of 34. The goals of the board were clear. 1, determine the nature of Bacillus icteroides, a bacterium which a famous Italian bacteriologist claimed was the cause of yellow fever, and the majority of the population in the scientific community believed him. Number 2, perform bacteriological studies on patients and victims, meaning those who had died from yellow fever. And 3, explore the theory of insect transmission, and I stress the word theory. There's a term that's used called the golden age of medical entomology, and it covers it from about the late 1870s up to about the time that we're speaking of, around 1900. There were several discoveries made on how malaria and Texas cattle fever and filariasis were transmitted. So a lot of people were starting to think that it was very possible that insects could in fact transmit yellow fever. The insect theory had been promoted in Cuba since 1881 by this gentleman, Dr. Carlos Juan Finlay. Finlay claimed that the mosquito, which then was called Culex fasciatus, which we now know as Aedes aegypti, or the yellow fever mosquito, transmitted yellow fever virus, but he had been unable to convince the scientific community during 20 years of experiments. Finlay's assistance, as pointed out in several later writings by Major Reed, proved invaluable to the success of the board. Now this slide is purposely put in for all of you who complain about the size of your office or the size of your shop or the size of your laboratory and your working conditions. The board began work on June 25th, 1900, and spent June and July on the bacteriology studies. And this small building served as Walter Reed's laboratory, and I don't see an air conditioner sticking out of the walls there anywhere, so June in Cuba was probably pretty uncomfortable. Cultures made from samples of 11 yellow fever victims were all negative for Bacillus icteroides, as shown in the right-hand column on this slide. The board could not produce a single shred of evidence supporting a bacterial etiology or cause for yellow fever. They could not verify the claim made by the Italian bacteriologist. I would like to point out that we did not know about the existence of viruses at this time. The medical community did know about bacteria, and they had specialized filters which they could pass human blood through that would trap those bacteria. But at the time we did not know about viruses, which are much smaller than bacteria and will pass right through those filters. At about this time, Major Reed became extremely influenced by 3 critical pieces of information. 1, a prisoner in Cuba had died from yellow fever on June 18th. None of the 8 other prisoners in the same cell got sick, including one who slept in the dead man's bed. 2, just 3 years prior in 1897, Sir Ronald Ross had proved that mosquitoes were the vectors of bird malaria. Ronald Ross was a British physician working in India when he did this important work. And 3, Henry Rose Carter, who is pictured on the far right in this slide, had recently worked out what we call the extrinsic incubation period concept for yellow fever, and he was now serving as a quarantine officer in Cuba, just by chance. His presence also greatly influenced the work of the board. So now let's take a minute to talk about this concept called the extrinsic incubation period. When an uninfected mosquito bites a human being who has yellow fever virus in their blood, the mosquito picks up that virus along with the human blood, and all of this goes into the mosquito's stomach or the midgut. There the virus begins to replicate and breaks out of the midgut and infects the body of the mosquito, particularly the salivary glands. And thousands of virus particles are then packed into the salivary glands. This whole process takes anywhere from about 10 days to 2 weeks, depending on a lot of factors, particularly temperature. And it's after this extrinsic incubation period, or development of the virus in the mosquito, that the mosquito can then bite another person and transmit the virus. On August 1st, the board met on the porch of the officers' quarters seen here. Major Reed's quarters are marked by the small black X and the large red arrow. They decided to test the mosquito theory. All members of the board agreed at this time that they must take the same risks which necessity would soon compel them to impose on any human volunteers. There was no animal model for yellow fever at this time, so any experiments had to be done on human beings. And shortly thereafter, fate played her hand. On the next day, August 2nd, Major Reed was ordered back to Washington to finish a critical report on typhoid fever. Remember, he had been very successful working for the Army on control of typhoid fever in the Army camps. During his absence, Doctors Lazier and Carroll began to test the mosquito theory. This slide demonstrates one method used to feed the mosquitoes. That gentleman is literally sticking his hand into a cage full of hungry mosquitoes and letting them have their fill of blood. On August the 30th, Dr. Carroll was taken seriously ill from the bite of one of Lazier's mosquitoes, or as he liked to call them, his birds. On September 4th, a second experimental case was produced in an Army private, and Major Reed was notified in Washington. We still have the letter that Major Reed wrote back when he heard this news, and on the back of the envelope he wrote, "Did the mosquito do it?" Under mysterious circumstances, Dr. Lazier himself was bitten on September the 13th, became ill on the 18th, and died on the 25th of September. Pictured here is a facsimile of Lazier's death notice, as well as one of his many obituaries that appeared. There was considerable controversy surrounding his death. After realizing the gravity of his illness, Lazier claimed he was bitten by accident while working in the hospital. Others, including Major Reed, felt that Lazier was a victim of self-experimentation, and as his death could have been ruled a suicide, the hospital story was fabricated so that his family would not be denied insurance benefits. Unfortunately, Lazier's laboratory notebook, which may answer this question, was lost shortly after the experiments were concluded. So let me just take a minute to set the stage for you. Walter Reed is back in Washington, D.C., and while he's been gone from Cuba, there have been 3 experimental cases, and I want to stress experimental. These were not produced under what we would call controlled scientific conditions with a written protocol. We have Dr. Carroll's case, which he survived. We have the case of the Army private, which was only known as Case X, by the way, and the fatal outcome of Dr. Lazier. On October 3rd, Major Reed returned to Cuba and immediately read Lazier's notebook and picked up key pieces of information. Although he understood that none of these first 3 cases of yellow fever were produced under controlled conditions, he still wrote the now classic paper, which you see in this slide, in which the board stated the following simple conclusions. Number 1, Bacillus icteroides stands in no causative relation to yellow fever, but when present should be considered as a secondary invader in this disease. And 2, the mosquito serves as the intermediate host for the parasite of yellow fever. Now the challenge was to conclusively prove that mosquitoes were the primary mode of transmission. Just showing that they could transmit the virus in the laboratory was not enough. To do this and to disprove that fomite theory, that idea that contaminated articles somehow spread this disease, controlled experiments using human volunteers were necessary. On November 20th, 1900, Camp Lazier was established. As seen in this slide, it consisted of 7 Army tents and would serve as a quarantine station for the volunteers. Where did these volunteers come from? They were drawn from Army soldiers and Spanish immigrants who were coming to Cuba to seek work. Each volunteer signed an informed consent, which was written in English and Spanish, and was offered $100 in gold for volunteering and another $100 if he got yellow fever. That's a pretty good two-for-one deal. Now remember, this was $100 in gold, and in 1900 that was a heck of a lot of money. This photo includes 6 of the volunteers, including Private John Kissinger, and I'd like to say a little more about him in a minute. As far as we know, in scientific experimentation, this was the first documented use of written, informed consent by human beings who were going to be used as research subjects. Kissinger, seen here, and a civilian clerk who had recently left the Army named John Moran were the first to volunteer their services to the board. After Major Reed explained the inherent dangers and the proposed payment, both men declined the money, making it their sole stipulation that they should receive no monetary reward. Upon hearing this, Reed reportedly touched his cap and said, "Gentlemen, I salute you." After being quarantined in Camp Lezier for over 30 days, Private Kissinger was experimentally infected by mosquito bite, became ill on December the 8th, and suffered through a moderately severe case of yellow fever, although it's always been my thought that while he was sick, he probably didn't think it was such a moderate thing to be going through. But luckily he did not die. Writing about Kissinger at a later date, Reed said, and I quote, "In my opinion, this exhibition of moral courage has never been surpassed in the annals of the Army of the United States." End the quote. In this letter, written on December the 10th, 2 days after Private Kissinger became ill, Reed mentions Kissinger's case and proudly points out next to the blue arrow that the theory is all right, referring to the mosquito theory. In a few brief days, the mosquito theory had been changed to fact. Although the board had clearly demonstrated that mosquitoes could transmit yellow fever virus, it had not ruled out the fomite theory. Remember, this was the accepted mode of transmission of the day. In order to address this question, a small building, 14 by 20 feet in size, was constructed, and you see the floor plan of the building in this slide. When the building was ready for occupation, 3 large boxes filled with sheets, pillowcases, and blankets were placed inside. This was no ordinary linen, however. Many of the articles had been purposely soiled with a liberal quantity of black vomit, urine, and fecal matter from recent victims of yellow fever. At 6 p.m., 3 American volunteers entered this building, which is known as the Fomite House, gingerly unpacked the linen, thoroughly shook out all the items, used the linen to prepare their beds, and settled in for what they hoped was a good night's sleep. This same scenario was followed for the next 20 days, although the men were allowed to spend the daytime hours in the tents in Camp Lezier. On December 19th, they were placed in quarantine for 5 days, and all remained in perfect health. Walter Reed was a very thorough scientist, and he wanted to be sure he got this right. So for good measure, the process was repeated from December 21st to January the 10th, using different volunteers. This time, however, they actually slept in the patient's soiled pajamas. And finally, just to be sure, it was repeated again from January 11th to the 31st. As an added treat, this time the men covered their pillows with towels soaked with the blood of recent cases. And again, all remained well. At a later time, 2 of these volunteers were given yellow fever by blood injection by the Reed Board, which proved that they were non-immunes or that they were susceptible to the disease during their time in the Fomite House. In this page of the letter mentioned earlier, Reed writes about the volunteers in the Fomite House and how they were relieved to hear that Private Kissinger had actually been infected by mosquito bite. So now the fomite theory was history. Now the logical question before the board was, and I'm quoting from one of the older documents, how does a house become infected with the disease? End the quote. In other words, what happens inside a house that causes a person to get sick? That's what they needed to answer. And to address this issue, a second house, similar in construction to the first one, to the Fomite House, was built. It consisted of 2 rooms separated only by a partition, and it was very sanitary compared to the fomite house. Additionally, all articles entering the house were steamed to decontaminate them. On December 21st, 1900, with Major Reed watching from one side of the screen partition, 15 female Aedes aegypti mosquitoes were released on the other side. These mosquitoes had all fed on patients while the patients had yellow fever virus in their blood and had been held in the laboratory for the appropriate time or for the extrinsic incubation period that we talked about earlier. So their cargo was deadly. At noon, our friend John Moran, clad in a nightshirt and fresh from a bath, entered the room and reclined on a cot. For the next 30 minutes, he was bitten by 7 mosquitoes while he held a hand lens and wrote a detailed account of what he observed. Later that day, he re-entered and took 5 more bites, and the next day, 3 more bites. Most importantly, for this to be a controlled scientific experiment, during each of Moran's visits, 2 non-immunes, or 2 people susceptible to yellow fever, remained on the other side of the partition at all times and slept there each night from December 21st to January 8th. So the only thing different on each side of the partition were the adult mosquitoes biting John Moran. Christmas Day 1900 came with a bang for John Moran. He awoke to find himself firmly in the grip of the case of yellow fever he seemed so intent on having. He had volunteered for some of the other experiments and had not gotten sick yet. The conclusions of the Reed Board were published on February 16, 1901, and presented at the Pan American Congress in Havana the same month. Conclusions 1 through 4 dealt with mosquito transmission and this whole idea of the extrinsic incubation period for yellow fever. Conclusions 5 through 8 discussed infection by blood injection, immunity, incubation period of the disease in humans, which by the way is called the intrinsic incubation period, and the rejection of the fomite theory. It says yellow fever is not conveyed by fomites, and hence disinfection of articles of clothing, bedding, or merchandise supposedly contaminated by contact with those sick with this disease is unnecessary. And this saved millions of dollars. Number 9 stated how a house became infected with yellow fever. Conclusion 10 was the most important, as it proposed that the spread of yellow fever could literally be stopped using vigorous mosquito control measures and patient isolation. It's interesting to note that one of the things that they did in the tropics with patients who were in the hospital was, in order to keep ants off of the patients, they would put small containers of water around each leg of the bed. And it was in these very containers of water that the yellow fever mosquito would breed. So we had sick patients lying in the bed with yellow fever virus and the mosquitoes growing in water just a foot or 2 away from them. So there was likely to be lots of transmission in the hospital. And finally, the board stated that although the mode of transmission was now known for yellow fever, the specific cause of yellow fever, the virus, remained a mystery. The Reed Board produced 22 cases of yellow fever under the controlled scientific conditions. 14 were by mosquito bite, 6 were by blood injection, and 2 were done by separating the serum from the red blood cells and then injecting the serum into volunteers. So a total of 22 cases. It is significant to note that although yellow fever may have a case fatality rate of 50% or higher, the controlled experiments produced no deaths. In other words, half of the people who get this sometimes die from it. It has been said that the board had good nursing, good diet, and good patient handling, but most of all they had good luck. Any fatalities among the volunteers would have terminated the experiments immediately, and we'll see that later in our story. This is the last known photograph taken of Walter Reed. The events in Cuba left him physically and mentally exhausted. The ordeal of human experimentation, as you might expect, had exacted a sizable toll. In Washington, he was plagued by the daily routine of military life, and his work on yellow fever was attacked by friends and enemies, jealous. Finally, and most incredibly, he was charged with being absent without leave, or what we in the military call AWOL, in connection with presenting the board's findings in Indianapolis. Reed, who was thankful his life had not been lived in vain, understood none of this and was humiliated. In November of 1902, he confided to friends that he was a very sick man. On November 17th, he was operated on for a ruptured appendix. 5 days later, he developed peritonitis, or infection in his gut, became unconscious, and he died on November 23rd at the young age of 51 and at the zenith, or at the height of his career. Major Reed is interred in Arlington National Cemetery, where a granite headstone and a bronze plaque commemorate his accomplishments. Among other items, the plaque states, quote, "He gave to man control over that dreadful scourge, yellow fever," end quote. Dr. James Carroll died in 1907 at the age of 53 from myocarditis, or infection of the lining of the heart, that he blamed on his case of yellow fever. Dr. Carroll left behind a wife and 5 children. Dr. Agramonte became a university professor and, as far as I know, lived a long and productive life. He never received any material reward for his share of the work on yellow fever. As mentioned earlier, Dr. Lazier died from yellow fever at the age of 34, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children, one of whom he never saw. He is interred in Baltimore, Maryland, where a battery in the harbor, as well as other things around the city, are named in his honor. The widows of Reed, Carroll, and Lazier all received pensions of $125 per month from the government. Now, some of you may have a hobby that I like to do, which is to tromp around in graveyards and look at graves. And part of my research on this involved that, as you can see in this picture. Dr. Lazier is buried in a very large cemetery in Baltimore called Loudon Park Cemetery. And when I showed up, I went to the desk and I said, I would like to find the grave of this famous doctor, Dr. Lazier. And the very nice lady who was working there pulled out their sheet of who's who, the famous people buried in their cemetery, which most cemeteries have. And I noticed that Dr. Lazier was not on the list. But as I scanned over it, there were 21 names. And the 21st person who was memorialized there had started the first strip mall or shopping center in Baltimore, and also was the person who started the first brewery. Now, I thought it was pretty important that they know about Dr. Lazier, and I will tell you that I was able to write a short paragraph about him, and he's now number 22 on the list in the cemetery's who's who. The benefits derived from the work in Cuba are truly inestimable. Without doubt, thousands of lives were spared and millions of dollars were saved. Dr. William Gorgas, pictured here, was a sanitary engineer for the Army working in Cuba. Skillfully applying the recommendations of the board, he coordinated an intensive mosquito control campaign. Within a few short months, yellow fever literally was eliminated from Havana. It was gone. Gone from a city where this disease had occurred every summer, every year for 400 years. He wiped it out in just a few months. General Gorgas then applied his methods in Panama, where yellow fever, along with malaria, had been major obstacles to the successful completion of the Panama Canal. Within a short time, yellow fever was gone, and the canal was a reality. If you ever have a chance to go through the Panama Canal, on one hillside, a very steep hillside, it's covered with nothing but white crosses. These are the graves of many of the French engineers who died from yellow fever and malaria while attempting to construct the canal. The United States continued to have outbreaks of yellow fever after 1900, but the fear and panic associated with prior epidemics was now replaced by determination and the cooperation in the fight against mosquitoes. This poster was used during the 1905 epidemic in New Orleans, the last major outbreak of yellow fever in the United States. And what became of the brave volunteers, without whom none of this would have been possible? Most were lost track of. They did not see themselves as any type of hero. They felt they were just doing something that they should do for the good of society by volunteering for these experiments. After about 10 years, however, it was decided that gold medals of honor should be given to them. But curiously, medals were awarded only to those who got sick or to those who had to sleep in that fomite house. There was no medal just for volunteering. Occasionally, reunions were held. As you might imagine, this was a fairly close-knit group after what they had gone through together. And pictured here is the program from one such event held in Indianapolis in 1933. And note the signatures of the volunteers on the left-hand side. John Kissinger's fate after Cuba is an interesting tale. He survived his battle with yellow fever, but not without some telling losses. He left the Army in 1901, returning to Indiana to try his hand at farming, but he was not physically strong enough. After working at various odd jobs, Kissinger, while walking home one night, collapsed and lost the use of his legs. An application to the government for pension, which John did reluctantly, was denied, as John could not prove that his disability was caused by his bout with yellow fever. To make ends meet, his wife took in washing, with John slowly and awkwardly assisting while propped in a chair. She also scrubbed post office floors. Finally, in 1907, Congress reconsidered, and Kissinger was awarded a pension of $12 per month and a few favors such as free streetcar rides. Ironically, he and Mrs. Kissinger lived in an area where there were no streetcars, however. Outraged at this action, many people wrote letters on Kissinger's behalf. And as a result of this public outcry, Kissinger was given a $100 per month pension in 1911. Incredibly, the pension was withdrawn shortly thereafter, and demand made for return of the past receipts. However, I'm pleased to tell you that eventually the pension was restored. Now, in the early 1920s, the Kissingers moved to a small town called Huntington, Indiana, which just happens to be where I'm from. So now you know how I got interested in this business. The American Medical Association became aware of John's plight, and through it, a fund was raised to purchase the house which you see here for the Kissingers. And now I feel really bad because I used to walk by this house on the way to school, and when there was snow there, I used to throw snowballs at it. Several of my relatives knew Mr. Kissinger and told me about him. I never met him. He passed on long before I was around, but several of my relatives were able to tell me stories about him. And he finally started to receive some of the accolades that he and the other volunteers richly deserved, in my opinion. He was a very modest man and rarely spoke about the events in Cuba unless he was asked. He was often interviewed by the media, and despite all the attention, he remained a humble soul. Now, it may not surprise you, but even Hollywood got into the act. John and Ida Kissinger were the guests of honor for the 1938 premiere of the movie called Yellow Jack, the somewhat inaccurate story of the events in Cuba. John and his wife Ida lived in Huntington until they thought it best to enter the Indiana Soldiers' Home in Lafayette. Hoping to relieve the pain in his joints, Kissinger moved to Florida, where he died in 1946 at the age of 68. He is interred in Huntington, as you see here, just about 100 yards from my parents, and his gravestone reads, and I quote, "A martyr to yellow fever in the interest of humanity and a hero of the Spanish-American War." End quote. The hospital in Huntington bears a plaque to Kissinger, and as the plaque states, Kissinger, Moran, and all the other volunteers truly were and still are quiet heroes. Also in Huntington, one corner of the Courthouse Museum is dedicated to Kissinger, and it's visited often by school children. The display contains several of Kissinger's uniforms, including the one he wore the day he was infected by mosquito bite, documents pertaining to the yellow fever experiments, numerous awards, photographs, and several of the items that you've seen in my presentation today. This painting by Dean Cornwell shows all the central figures in this fight against yellow fever. Although this exact scene couldn't have taken place, it is in fact a fitting tribute to those involved. The two standing figures at the right of the painting in blue medic jackets and white pants represent John Kissinger and John Moran. Now I would like to paraphrase Howard Kelly from his book on Walter Reed. The inspiration of these men lies in the fact that though men of war, they ravaged no distant lands, destroyed no tens of thousands to make their reputation, but by quiet methods, when there was a hideous plague, saved countless lives and swept away this disease which from time immemorial had periodically visited our shores, devastated our fair land, and too often snatched from the years of peace and plenty all their blessings. Walter Reed sailed home on February 9th, 1901, never to return to Cuba, although he did want to go back and complete some experiments, but he was not allowed to go. On board with him were John Kissinger and John Moran. Major Gorgas, who remained in Cuba, believed in the validity of the Reed Commission's experiments, but he felt that other means besides just controlling mosquitoes would be needed to completely eliminate yellow fever. One such approach, ill-fated as it turned out, involved immunization using infected mosquitoes. With the advice and consent of Gorgas and General Leonard Wood, Dr. Juan Gutierrez, a Cuban physician, began a series of experiments designed to immunize humans by attempting to give them a mild case of yellow fever. The hypothesis was simple. Allow mosquitoes to feed on a mild case of yellow fever, hold them for the appropriate time in the laboratory, and then refeed them on people who were susceptible to yellow fever, thereby giving them a mild case of the disease. Well, unfortunately, it doesn't work this way with yellow fever. Tragically, the cases produced by Dr. Gutierrez were much more severe than expected. 3 of his 8 volunteers died, including Miss Clara Moss, who is pictured here. Clara was born on the 28th of June, 1876 in East Orange, New Jersey. Her parents were German immigrants, and she was the oldest of 9 children. Economic hardship forced her to leave school at the age of 15, and she worked in the Newark Orphan Asylum. In 1893, she entered the nursing program at Newark German Hospital, graduating in 1895. And just 3 years later, at the age of 21, she was named the head nurse. So this young lady was very, very sharp. She also was very ambitious. During 1898, Clara served as a contract nurse for the United States during the Spanish-American War. At this time, nurses were not regular members of the Army as they are now. She cared for soldiers in Jacksonville, Florida, Savannah, Georgia, and Santiago, Cuba, becoming intimately familiar with diseases such as typhoid, malaria, dengue, and yellow fever. After successful service, she was discharged in February 1899 and returned to New Jersey. Well, I guess she didn't have enough adventure in her life, because the following November, Clara boldly volunteered for service in the Philippines, where the U.S. Army was fighting, but after 7 months, she was sent home reportedly to recover from a case of dengue fever. And then in October of 1900, Clara volunteered again for work in Cuba in the campaign to control mosquitoes and yellow fever. And upon receiving an urgent response from Major Gorgas to report immediately, she did so. The telegram is shown in the upper right of this slide, and it says, "Come at once, Gorgas, Chief Sanitary Officer." Upon returning to Cuba, Miss Moss worked in the Las Animas Hospital caring for victims of yellow fever. She also volunteered for the Gutierrez mosquito experiments and sent her payment of $100 home to her mother. Of the 19 participants, she was the only woman and the only American. She received numerous mosquito bites during May, June, and July, but she did not contract yellow fever, not even a mild case, as some historical documents report. Clara Moss was bitten for the last time on August 14th, 1901. She became ill on the 18th, and even with the best medical care available, she died on the 24th of August at the age of 25. The 3 telegrams seen on the left in this slide were sent by Dr. Gorgas to Clara's family, keeping them apprised of her illness and of her death. After Clara became ill, She wrote to her mother in New Jersey, and the quote is seen in the lower right hand of this slide. "God will care for me in the yellow fever hospital the same as if I were home. I will send you nearly all I earn, so be good to yourself and the two little ones. You know I am the man of the family, but do pray for me." End quote. Clara's death and the deaths of two other volunteers sent shockwaves through the Army that reverberated all the way back to the United States. The major New York City newspapers carried the story of her death on page 1, as seen in this slide, and shortly thereafter, all human experimentation on yellow fever in Cuba was stopped. The New York Times reported that not only was Clara willing to incur the risk of infection and disease, but she desired to make herself immune to better serve those suffering from the disease. With her sister Sophia present, Clara Moss was hastily buried in Havana. About 1 year later, her body was returned to the United States and reinterred with full military honors on February 20th, 1902 in Fairmount Cemetery in Newark, New Jersey. Her plaque reads in part, "Greater love hath no man than this." Clara's contributions and memory have been honored in several different ways. A Senate committee finding, quote, "that the services of this nurse can be accepted as of a military character at the time of her death," end quote, resulted in the award of a pension to her mother, which I'm sure was a lot of help to the family. Postage stamps bearing her likenesses were issued by Cuba in 1951 and by the United States in 1976, which coincided with the 100th anniversary of her birth. Not bad to have two different countries issue a postage stamp in your honor. Also in 1976, Clara was inducted into the American Nursing Association's Hall of Fame. In 1952, the Newark German hospital, where Clara had once been the head nurse, was renamed the Clara Moss Memorial Hospital in her honor, and it retains that name today. The angel Clara Moss lived and died a true American heroine. Let those of us who toil in the fields of mosquito control and public health resolve to honor and cherish her name and memory, and the names and memories of so many others who have made the ultimate sacrifice in the name of humanity. If you have any questions or comments about my presentation, please feel free to contact me at my email address, which is on the screen. It is stanton.cope@osd.mil.